Hi everybody, and welcome to the NCDS DataBytes Lunchtime Webinar Series. Today's speaker, Tony Hay, is Chief Data Scientist at the United Kingdom Science and Technology Council. Before joining this team, Tony was Corporate Vice President of the External Research Division of Microsoft Research. His research interests focus on parallel programming for parallel systems built from mainstream commodity components. With Jack Dungara, Rolf Hempel, and David Walker, he wrote the first draft of a specification for a new message passing standard called MPI. And this initiated the process that led to the successful MPI standard that we know today. Tony is a fellow of the UK's Royal Academy of Engineering. He also has served on several national committees in the U.S., including the National Science Foundation's Advisory Committee for Cyber Infrastructure and the Department of Energy's Office of Science Advanced Scientific Computing Advisory Committee. He also serves on the advisory board of the NSF Data One project and is a trustee of AUI, the organization that manages U.S. radio telescopes for the NSF. Today's talk is titled Toward a Third Age of Computing, and it'll last about 30 to 40 minutes, and we'll have time for Q&A at the end. Please feel free to type your questions in the chat box, and then we'll hold them till the end of the talk and read them back to Tony and give him a chance to answer. So thank you all for showing up today, and welcome, Tony. The floor is now yours.
Hi there. Thanks very much for the introduction. Yes, it's great to be giving a talk to the webinar series at NCDS. So what I'm going to talk about is how computing has started, how it evolved to get where we are now, and where it's likely to go in the future. And that's really the interesting challenge for us, is what we're going to do about the future. But I'll just at least briefly go through the first, what Butler Lampson calls the third age of computing. So he identifies the first two, and the first age of computing is about using computers for doing computing, like spreadsheets, like simulations, and so on, which we all know about. Second age of computing, which was another 30 years or so, was when we started connecting them together, and we got things like the internet, we got search engines, we have social networks, and so on. And the third age of computing is where we are now, when computers start to do things that we want. Just to give an example, I was in the car coming from the supermarket with my son in a Volkswagen Touran, and he said, oh, he had to park the car outside my house in the street, and he said, "What's this, Dad?" And he pressed a button, and yes, the steering wheel changed of its own accord, the car parked. And that's exactly the sort of thing that we want computers to do for us. It's actually useful, nice parallel parking. It was really great. But as usual, with any good side, there's also a downside. And I was talking to a friend of mine at Lawrence Berkeley Lab, and he was driving 30 miles to go to Livermore Lab, and he was taking a lab car. When he got to Livermore and he saw his boss said, "I'm terribly sorry, I'm going to have to report you for speeding." Now, he said, "Well, I haven't been stopped by the police." He said, "No, the car reported you." So we'll have smart cars, and they can do things that are clever, but they can also do things we might not actually really want. And that's what Butler Lampson meant by embodiment. So he called this simulation the first age, communication the second age, and the third age he called embodiment, which is computers doing intelligent things that we would like them to do. Okay, so my involvement with computing started when I was on sabbatical at Caltech, and I was doing numerical particle physics calculating on a lattice, a computer lattice. And I went to this seminar. It was the weekly seminar they have at Caltech, and it was being given by Carver Mead, who is the Gordon Moore Professor of Computing. And he's the guy who explained why Moore's law works. And this graph shows how Moore's law, extrapolated from very, very small numbers, has continued to be true, that the number of transistors on a chip essentially doubles every 18 months or so. And what Carver Mead showed in his lecture was that computers were going to continue getting smaller, cheaper, and faster for the next 30 years. Well, that was in 1980, and that was a pretty good prediction. And we're now getting to the stage where we're getting to the end of Moore's law, and that's another interesting thing. But so Gordon Moore and Moore's law started all this business. It got me interested in supercomputing because I couldn't afford a Cray supercomputer costing several million, but I could afford to connect up lots of microprocessors, and that's what this chip is. It was the first microprocessor in 1971, and by connecting, it's like a computer on a chip almost, needs a bit of extra memory and so on to do things that are serious, but it is actually a way to build a very powerful computer. And as we all know, the sad thing about MPI as a standard, it's still a standard for programming parallel computers, these distributed memory computers. So although in the 1980s connecting computers, these microprocessors together, didn't seem like a very competitive thing to do against Cray supercomputers, but actually because of Moore's law, they were bound to win in the end, and that's why the supercomputers we have today are all of this character, passing messages between microprocessor nodes. Okay, so that had about 2,000 transistors on, and that was 1971. Here, 2015, this is a not very good photograph of an Intel Xeon chip, and this has about probably something like 4 billion transistors. So there's really been progress, I think you'd have to say, in miniaturizing and making faster our computers. So 4 billion is an interesting number. We have about 200 billion neurons in our brain, and there's several hundred billion stars in our galaxy. So these are big numbers, and the number of transistors on a silicon chip today is actually getting close to interesting numbers like that. So this is the state of the art, and what do we use these things for? Well, the first stage of computing, according to Butler, was actually using computers to compute. Computers for simulation, he called it. And this was where it started in the war. John Marshley and Presper Eckert and the ENIAC supercomputer, which was a gigantic thing, 80 feet long, weighs tons of things. And this is how you programmed it. You had to plug the connections in, and the first programmers in this sense were women who've only recently been recognized for their contribution. And so this was, it's interesting looking at science fiction novels. In science fiction novels, almost everybody completely missed the miniaturization of computing. And they all had, if you got a more powerful computer, the bigger it would be. And so you had computers the size of a planet. Interestingly, Isaac Asimov also had that, but he also had this sort of schizophrenic, because he also had robots where the computing was in the brain and was really obviously very small. So he had this sort of schizophrenic sort of set of novels. That was in the 1950s, end of the war, and beginning of the 1950s. These were the early machines, and the big problem was memory. And eventually, in the 1950s and 60s, computers were taken up by companies like IBM. IBM were the dominant company, and they commercialized it. And one of the original pioneers at MIT was really depressed by in the old days, you could go and play with computers when graduate students and faculty could actually go and access the computers yourself. But in this sort of period of computing, you handed your deck of cards to an operator who took it away, and he was the only one, or she was the only one, allowed to touch the machine. So it was like the machine as a demigod. And really, using computers in a much more interactive way was the vision of a few people, and I'll talk about some of those later on. But this is how computing was for most people in the 1950s and 60s. But in the 1970s, Xerox realized they needed a new business, and they wanted to take over the sort of business of the intelligent office, if you like. And so they set up the Xerox PARC, Palo Alto Research Center, on the West Coast, even though their primary operation was on the East Coast. And these guys, Chuck Thacker, Butler Lampson, who are shown here, with Alan Kay, built what was essentially the first personal computer. It was called the Alto, and it had almost everything you would recognize today. It could go under your desk. You had your own screen. It had a WYSIWYG word processor, the first one that was there. It had Windows, a mouse, and pull-down menus and things like that. And it also was connected by Ethernet, and laser printers were also developed at Xerox PARC. So really, this was the first microprocessor, the first personal computer. The trouble was, of course, it was too expensive, and Xerox never made it work financially. But of course, Butler Lampson and Chuck Thacker, two Turing Award winners, were well aware of Moore's law, and all they had to do was wait, and this would become cheap enough that everybody could have one. And so it was a very strange period of computing history, 1975. The people who made the next step were not the IBMs, the corporate computing people, nor was the embryonic computer science departments in universities. It was actually hobbyists and a couple of grad students and undergraduate students, Bill Gates and Paul Allen, who actually wrote the first compiler for this computer kit. And the Alto, this was the Altair, and it was based around Intel's new 8800 microprocessor. And the rest is history, as they say, but that was the beginning of a period of time, very short period, where actually major advances were done by amateurs, if you like, hobbyists, and it was a period. And that was started off in Albuquerque and then later moved to Seattle, as you know, but slightly later on, in the Valley, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak set up Apple. And I was actually visiting Stanford Linear Accelerator Center in 1976, and what I didn't know, I was only interested in the new quark that had been discovered. It was the charm quark, and it was really exciting period for particle physics. But actually, it was also the beginnings of the revolution of personal computers, because they had the Homebrew Computer Club was actually held meetings at SLAC in the auditorium there. And so again, it started off like the Altair, that you had a hobbyist and you put together a kit and you got the pieces, and this is the first Apple computer you can see here where someone's built a nice box to put it on. But Steve Jobs had a vision, and his vision was actually what people wanted was it all packaged up and a commodity thing that you could buy. And so that was what the Apple II was. And you know, this is an advert for the Apple II showing how people, you know, could just pick it up and use it. Well, of course, the software wasn't really able to do that. But because they could pick up all the things that had been developed at Xerox PARC, Windows and a mouse and all this sort of stuff with word processors, it really had most of the things that business want today. The thing it was lacking was the spreadsheet, and that was the killer app for the PC in business. It was invented by Dan Bricklin. He was sitting in Harvard Business School taking an MBA, and he realized instead of doing all these boring calculations and repeating them with different scenarios, if you could automate that with a spreadsheet program, that would really be enormously helpful. And that was the beginning of the business application. And then Gates and Allen with Microsoft combined with IBM, and along came the IBM PC. And you see Control-Alt-Delete came into our life because they couldn't, the board was so constrained they couldn't put a reset button. And so an IBM engineer actually said, well, what can I do? If I use Control-Alt and Delete, it means you can't do it by accident to reset the machine. And he was once interviewed with Bill Gates on a television program, and Bill was complaining that, you know, David Bradley had actually, he was the one who forced everybody to have to learn about Control-Alt-Delete. And Bradley said, no, it was you who made everybody do it with your operating system. And Bill Gates had to admit that Bradley was right. Anyway, Control-Alt-Delete is part of our history. And we started off with simulations for weather forecasts or for designing atom bombs and things. That was what the early computers were used for. Then we had spreadsheets, and of course computer games were things done by graduate students illegally in the middle of the night. They weren't supposed to use these expensive machines for trivial things, but of course it spawned a big business, and with these personal computers, computer games became of age, and now they're a huge industry, as we all know. So that's the first stage of computing, getting you up to date where we are now. The second age of computing is when we connected them together, and this brings us to a man called J.C.R. Licklider, who was a professor of psychology at MIT, and he was very much interested not as computer as a demigod that you can't touch and play with and interact with, but he was interested in interactive computing, and his vision of artificial intelligence was slightly different from his colleagues at MIT, Minsky and people like that. His vision was that the future would be, he called it man-machine symbiosis. The computer would be assisting you in making decisions, and I think that's where we are now. And he also realized that it would make sense to connect them all together, and that's what he was then given a job in ARPA, the Advanced Research Projects Agency, and that was the vision that he had, connecting all the computers up so people could share computers. Now, in those days, the computers were expensive and difficult to get, and so people at MIT and so on weren't very keen on letting other people use their computers. So the people who volunteered for the first phase were all on the West Coast who didn't have this. So it was UCLA, UC Santa Barbara, SRI and Stanford, and Utah were the first nodes on what became the ARPANET. And this was in '69, but only a few years later, you see that the ARPANET had grown to cover the whole of the USA, connected Hawaii, and it also connected to England, to the UK. UCL is University College London, and that's actually, I remember logging on to the ARPANET to access a machine at Caltech in Pasadena at the beginning of the '80s. So the ARPANET became of age, and the killer app for the ARPANET was, in the end, not sharing expensive computers, which was what people originally thought it would be used for. The killer app was, of course, email, and that was the major use of the ARPANET, that you could actually collaborate and interact using email. And this is Ray Tomlinson, who died this year, actually, who had the idea of you could do email on a single computer. So this was actually making it so you could do it on distributed computers around the ARPANET, and the @ sign was introduced by Ray. And of course, then we had a network, and other people built networks, and then you could join them up using TCP/IP, and that was done by Vint Cerf and Bob Kahn, who developed the TCP/IP protocols, and that's now used to connect networks all around the world. And this is a sort of image of today's internet, which connects probably well over 30% of the world's population. Over 2 billion people are connected by the internet, which is some growth from the days of the beginnings of the ARPANET. And so that was the beginning of, now we're learning how to use computers when they're interacted together, and that's what people have been doing. And Tim Berners-Lee was picking up ideas from Ted Nelson, who had the idea of hypertext, and he and Doug Engelbart were both inspired by Vannevar Bush, who wrote an article called As We May Think, which envisaged the future. This was way back just after the war. Vannevar Bush wrote this article saying there'd obviously be so much information that we wouldn't be able to find our way to the useful things, and what we should do was follow trails of other people. And this was the beginning of the idea of links, that you can go from this site here to another site over here, and using the internet. And then Tim Berners-Lee picked up these ideas and actually developed a very simple protocol for being able to access information on other sites and download it and so on. What's shown there is Tim, but also he had some friends at CERN who actually were amateur singers, and these were the CERNettes, and this was the first image ever put on the internet, and it was done on the World Wide Web by Tim Berners-Lee at CERN. And so this actually made it possible for ordinary mortals to go and use the internet and access and browse and so on, and this was the beginning. And incidentally, it was a sort of black project at CERN. It wasn't actually supported by the senior management at CERN. It was sort of a protected project within the computing division. And CERN deserved a lot of credit for making the protocols and everything royalty-free, and everybody could use them. And I think that's been a major element in the reason why World Wide Web was one of the protocols that was around, and it was the one that really took off, and it was because it was free. That's what Tim believes. Right, so when you've got all these websites with all this information on, and people were building websites, and they had the browser, the Mosaic browser, which was developed at NCSA in Illinois, how do you find information on that that's useful to you? Well, I remember in the 90s, I was using a web browser called Alta Vista, which was the best there was at the time. But these two guys, Sergey Brin and Larry Page from Google, hadn't got Google at the time. They were Stanford graduate students, and they had this envision of getting the whole of the internet and looking at the links between the sites, and they believed that was important. And because Larry had academic parents, he understood about citations. When you have a paper, you cite another paper. So how can you decide what's an important page? Well, you can look at the number of links that point to it. But you need to do more than that. You need to look at the importance of the site with the link. So if it's, you know, Tony Hay, that's one thing, but if it's a Nobel Prize winner, that's perhaps more significant. And so by taking into account, they had built a search engine which they deployed on the Stanford campus, and it was really very popular. So what did they do? They tried to sell it. They tried to sell the idea, the algorithm they called PageRank, a play on Larry's name, and they tried to sell it to Alta Vista, who were owned by Digital, and they wouldn't buy it. And so they decided to try and sell it to Yahoo, who was also founded by two graduate students from Stanford. And Yahoo wouldn't buy it, but one of the founders, David Philo, said, well, you know, why don't you just start a company? And that's what they did, of course. And the rest, as they say, is history. Okay, and once you've got a network, you can have a social network. And now we see Twitter, Facebook, all these social network applications. And that's another phase of the learning how to use connected computers. And that's what we're doing now. And again, I said, with every upside, there's usually a downside, and this is the downside this is from the Microsoft digital crimes wall, and this is just one shot of one particular virus. It's a thing that takes over your computer and, for example, can send spam email to all the people on your connection list. And this shows you the infection rate. So it looks to me like Spain is very badly infected, as is Mexico. The US and Brazil, not so good either. Canada looks good, but not many people live there, and so on. So this is just one virus, and you do need to worry about these things. These now are extremely serious, and they're both a military threat, but they're also a threat to ordinary people, people stealing your passwords, people stealing your digital identity, people stealing your money, and these are things that people now have to care about. So that's the upside and then downside. Okay, so that brings us up to date, and this is Butler's third age, where now computers are going to do things that are useful. He called it computers for embodiment. So let's just look at a few examples here and see what sort of examples are coming along. So we now see deployed, we will see driverless cars, but at the moment we see increasingly smart cars. This shows a Mercedes, actually, which has all sorts of sensors and it has radar screens which can tell you what's coming. It can tell the difference between a building, a wall, and a person because we've used clever computer software. So it can actually take action. If we're going to hit something, it can brake for us and so on. So these type of applications are coming along, and they are going to really revolutionize the way we drive around cities and transport as a whole. And they're an element, of course, of smart cities, which we'll come to later. Okay, so how do these things work? Well, they learn by experience, and these are so-called machine learning algorithms, and this is a simple one based on a thing called neural networks. In our brain, we have many billions of neurons, and they have many trillions of connections between them, and that's a very complex system. This is a very much simplified version where you have nodes with connections between them. And what you do is you show it an image here, and you train the result that you want here by training and calculating how you have to adjust the strength of the connections in order that if you show it an A, it tells you it's an A here. Show it a B, it tells you it's a B. So you can do letter recognition, you can do image recognition, and so on. And so these neural networks were very early on because they were mimicking the way the human brain. But most recently, we've now got, instead of just one hidden layer, multiple hidden layers, many hidden layers, and a mechanism for teaching it how to learn. So the big advantage here is you can train it on one thing, and then the more data you show it, it gets better at recognizing. And that's the feature of these systems, that you train it on a set of data, and then the more data it sees, the better it gets at recognizing what you're teaching it. So this is just one type of neural network. Another mechanism, this is what was done at Microsoft when I was there with the Kinect camera. It was a 3D camera on an Xbox, and it could tell three-dimensional depth, not just the conventional image. So you had a conventional image, but you also had depth information. And you could train it, so two people were playing, you needed to know whether it was my hand or the hand of the person next to me, and so you had to train it so it could tell, oh, my hand's hidden behind my partner's body, and so on. And the body could be many different shapes. It could be children, it could be fat people, it could be thin people, and they could be in all sorts of poses. So what they did was yes, they had some real images, but they also generated millions of synthetic images, and they used what are called decision trees. Is like 20 questions when you ask things, but it was a much more complex set. Decision tree was more like a decision forest, and from that they were able to train the camera to recognize that it was me, not the person next to me, it was my hand, not their hand, and so on, and you could control the machine by gestures. It also had a very sophisticated audio system, which was, it's a noisy environment, it was a room, you were playing games, it needed to know it was my voice rather than the voice of the person next to me, and so it had a very directional and clever audio system to make it work. Well, these are the sort of clever algorithms that you're now beginning to see. And so this was images, and the previous one could recognize number plates, for example, and other things. Okay, what type of applications? Well, I mean, I have a rather unique object here. It's called a Windows phone. I'm sure most of you have iPhones or something like that, and you can talk to your personal assistant. And you can talk to Siri. I talk to Cortana on my phone, and I can ask all sorts of things like, Cortana, open the pod bay doors, and she will reply in less than a second, I'm sorry, Tony, I can't do that, or whatever. How does that become possible? It becomes possible because this is not an isolated machine. It's connected to massive computing power in the cloud, and that transforms these mobile devices into incredibly clever devices. And when I speak into it, it goes up and does the speech translation and processing, and then gives me an answer, constructs an answer, all in less than a second. So it's really, if it's not connected to the internet, you're in trouble, but otherwise these machines are now incredibly powerful, essentially a supercomputer that you hold in your hand. So that's the way mobile devices have evolved, and they will continue to to evolve, and there will be sensors. The Internet of Things will give you many, many billions of devices. And you'll have intelligence everywhere. These are just two devices. That's the iWatch, which can tell you everything about whether you're going to have a heart attack or whatever your blood sugar is or whatever. And the other one is a Skype thing where I can speak into Skype using English, and it will come out at the other end in China to my colleague in China in Chinese, or in Portugal in Portuguese, and so on. So these automatic speech translations are getting better. They're getting much more realistic, and it was these deep neural nets which enabled a step change in language processing. And so now we're getting really much better. We're getting, on some sets of data, we're getting close to human error rates, and that's really one of the initial holy grails of computer science. So intelligence everywhere, and the Internet of Things will affect everything we do: transportation, the home, healthcare, security, retail shopping, and so on, with Amazon and everything else. So this is what's coming. What are the downsides? Well, there are downsides, and one of the downsides is that your clever car is actually now vulnerable. It's connected up to the Internet, and you can actually have, and there's a 60-minute program which shows a car being hacked, and it hacks the brakes. And so you try and stop, and it doesn't stop. So there is a downside to most of these applications, and you need to be very careful you don't get very many unexpected consequences of this smart applications. Okay, so where are we going? Well, the applications I've talked about, this is a quotation from Stuart Russell and Peter Norvig's book on artificial intelligence. The assertions that machines could act as if they were intelligent is called weak AI, and the assertion that machines are actually thinking, and not just simulating thinking, is called the strong AI hypothesis. So all the applications we've talked about are simulating intelligence. It's actually a computer program. It actually learns from data. Yes, it's a very smart program, but it isn't independently thinking. It isn't capable of independent thought. So where are we going with this? Well, I don't know if you saw the Imitation Game in recently when they had Benedict Cumberbatch playing Alan Turing, and he was one of the pioneers, of course, of the early days of computing, and had, not only did he do crack German codes during the war, he also actually thought about computers for playing chess and computers for artificial intelligence. And he rephrased that by having a test that you could have a computer or a person in a room and you couldn't see which, and you could ask it questions and it would give you answers on your screen, and you had to tell which was a computer or a person. And if you couldn't tell, that's a pragmatic definition of intelligence. So it's one way of doing the defining intelligence. Other ways, this was in 1997, IBM built a computer which was a parallel computer, lots of computing power, lots of special chips. It was called Deep Blue, and they programmed in all the standard openings, all the standard endings, and also in the intermediate positions, they just used brute force. So yes, they were able to look ahead many further times, and they were able to score each position, and they could go further than a human being can go because it was too difficult to keep it all in your head. And so by doing that, they beat Garry Kasparov, who was the world champion of chess. But it wasn't intelligent. It was just brute force, that they could look further ahead than any human. They didn't have any intuition, but they could do brute force, and they had all the standard openings and the standard endings. So it was very clever, but it isn't real intelligence. So that, but on the other hand, you would have said before that playing chess obviously requires intelligence. Well, of a sort. And then more recently, in 2011, they did a wonderful stunt playing against the two most successful Jeopardy players on US television. And to do Jeopardy, you have to teach the computer all sorts of things. Here on this particular screen, you need to know about Belgium. You need to know about dinosaurs, notable women, all these things. You have to teach it all this information. And then you have to teach it speech understanding, because the Jeopardy sort of inverts the question. You instead of saying what is the capital city of Belgium, you would say Brussels, and it would have to guess that the country is Belgium. So you sort of invert the questions, and they're sometimes rather cryptic and difficult to find out. Well, the answer in 2011 was that Watson actually beat the world's best Jeopardy players. And in so doing, is it demonstrating real intelligence? What was also available to the studio audience, though not to the players, was a screen showing IBM Watson's top 5 best guesses. And the first one was the one it chose, but you could see from some of the others, it had absolutely no understanding of the question. He got it completely wrong. And so David Verrucci, who was the guy at IBM who developed it, looking in Watson's brain. Well, you could see from looking into it that the computer didn't understand the problem. And John Searle, a philosopher at Berkeley, attacks the idea of strong AI by this example. This is his Chinese room example, where you put in questions and symbols in Chinese. All the person inside does is look it up and see what he's supposed. If he gets this symbol, he puts out that symbol, and so on. And so from an outside observer, it looks like the person inside understands Chinese, and of course he doesn't. And so what Searle commented on Watson was that Watson wasn't intelligent. It didn't even know it was playing a game or that it had won. It had no idea of any of that because it's a dumb machine. So will we ever get things like R2-D2 coming to rescue the world and actually seemingly be able to behave independently? Or will you have this nightmare of Skynet and robots coming to kill you? Or will you get, robots that you fall in love with, all right? And this is her when he falls in love with the operating system. And then the computer, because it can manage many relationships at once, is clearly unfaithful to him, and so on. So, and there's another great movie, science fiction movie, about the Turing test, which is Ex Machina, which came out last year, which is also an interesting exploration of this. But the question is, will we really ever get computers that are really intelligent? And if Ray Kurzweil, who is in the Bay Area, works for Google, talks about the singularity, and this could be a fourth age of computing where they're really intelligent, where computers can outperform humans, and that's what Kurzweil believes. My hero as a physicist was, of course, Richard Feynman, and Richard Feynman actually spent the last 5 years of his life lecturing on computing. He's well known and famous for his lectures on physics and his Nobel Prize and everything else and Feynman diagrams, but actually he spent the last 5 years lecturing on physics. And his view of a computer was that a computer is like a file cabinet, and it's a dumb file clerk. So the file clerk can go and get the information on the piece of paper, do what it says, go and get another one, put the card back, and so on. And he can just do it incredibly fast. He's doing very dumb things, but it's going very fast. So his view was that a computer is like a very fast, dumb file clerk. The inside of a computer is as dumb as hell, but it goes like mad. So are we going to get Kurzweil's view of the future or Feynman's? And Feynman lectures on computation, I found out about this because I wrote them up. He asked me before he died if I would write them up. And that was one thing. And they're at a sort of undergraduate level. And they're interesting things. He talks about the limits of computing due to mathematics, due to thermodynamics, due to noise, due to engineering, and also due to quantum mechanics. And so he proposes a quantum computer, which now we're beginning to realize. But he also gave lectures on computing at a very unconventional venue. That was to Caltech students. But he also went to a new age therapy place on Big Sur called Esalen. And there he gave, you can get these videos, and this is a video he gave about computers and computers for the inside out. And he talks about the file clerk. And so because I'd done both of these, I was stimulated to try and do a popular book on computer science because I think it's so important for the next generation. If they want to have jobs, engaging them in computing at an early age, knowing computing is more than using a word processor or a spreadsheet or being able to program in Python, it's actually understanding algorithms. You've got to have something to program. And so that's what Feynman inspired me to look at, and this is the book. Some of this lecture is based on that book. But where are we going in the future? What are the future challenges left? Well, the future, here are a couple of books that I do recommend you read. One is called The Rise of the Robots, with the subtitle, Technology and the Threat of a Jobless Future. And it is about the fact that these weak AI applications, these smart applications, are going to remove whole swathes of jobs. So just as a trivial example, in Oregon, they used to have 300 fire lookouts in the summer. And of course, you had to feed the people, you had to get them up there, you had to get water, and they had to stay awake and so on. And now they have algorithms that can detect the difference between clouds and smoke and a fire. So they can tell, you can have most of these have now been replaced by a camera with an intelligent software system, which can actually work, 24 hours a day. You don't need to feed it, just need the electricity, and that's all you have to do. And so that's just one example of a whole swathe of jobs being taken out by these intelligent applications. And this is another book by an ex-colleague of mine at Microsoft, Jaron Lanier, Who Owns the Future? And it's about computers are getting so intelligent and clever, they understand and can track everything we click on. And on a page, there's many adverts and things for trying to get you to buy things. And so you look up something, and suddenly you get piled on adverts for all sorts of things. I was looking at a treadmill for working at a desk, and suddenly I now get all these adverts for desktop treadmills. And so somebody's looking at what I'm doing, using that, selling it to the company who can then advertise to me. And so Who Owns the Future examines actually who benefits from all this. Who gets the money? There's a real danger with the sort of Web 2.0 world that anybody can take any, music, video, work, papers are being, it's difficult getting a living as a journalist. It's difficult getting a living as a professional museum. Lots of things are changing. So we're in a very confusing time, and there will be many challenges ahead. But for me, there's one really exciting challenge. In our brain, we have these very simple nodes called neurons, which are really the simple chemical. You put enough signal into all the dendrites coming into it, and it'll fire and send a signal on. And they're very slow, much slower than the computer switch, but that's how our brains work. So we have a couple of 100 billion neurons in our brain. Why is that intelligent and capable of independent thought? Whereas, if you build a supercomputer with many hundreds and thousands of Intel Xeon chips, you have many transistors there, but it's certainly not intelligent. So I think I agree with Daniel Dennett that human consciousness is about the last surviving mystery. So really, we have now the Brain Initiative, and we have also computers. We can do some simulations, and they're converging together. This is really a very exciting challenge, and is a challenge for the future. With that, I'll stop, and thank you for listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. That was great. Okay, I have a couple of questions here, and I'm going to read them back to you, and you can answer them. The first question here is, do we need a more secure internet protocol that replaces TCP/IP?
Well, it's clear that we do need to do something about security of the internet, yes. And I have many worries. Now, I mean, these things are computers, and now you're seeing viruses and applications with viruses in them attacking these. And, the mobile phone suppliers have not been in the business like, Apple and Microsoft are doing regular patches of when they see a vulnerability. And so I'm worried about all these apps. Why are they free? Well, actually, it's because you are the business. So that's the good side. That's not so bad. But on the other hand, it is bad if there's a virus in there and it takes all your stuff. So I don't know what the answer is. I just printed out today Beyond the Internet, which is a workshop organized by the NSF looking at software-controlled networks where you could configure them in much more flexible ways than a hardwired system. But I think I really worry about the vulnerability, and I don't have an answer, and I think that's a great research topic, and I think cybersecurity is really going to be a major challenge. So I don't think there's an easy answer, but I think it is one that's going to be a major challenge for many years to come.
Okay. Next question is, Tony, what are you telling your grandchildren to study?
What am I telling my grandchildren? Well, I actually do have some grandchildren now. They're rather small. What they're studying now is football and games. But I think really I do worry about jobs. I mean, the book by Ford I suggested talks about the fact that whilst the wealth of the country's gone up, the average wage hasn't. So that means that you know, fewer people are getting richer and richer, and the rest of us are not. And so, how can you get a good job where you can do all the things you used to do? Well, how can you protect yourself? Well, I think it helps if you understand computers and you understand mathematics well enough to do things that are useful. And I think people will always need people who understand and can use computers and can connect them, can do simulations on them, and can protect them. So I do think there's a plot I used to look at when I was funding universities at Microsoft, and it's a plot of the undergraduate subjects chosen in the US, and it's a big curve and goes up from science to social science and humanities, and the bulk of them, you know, huge peak at social sciences and humanities, much smaller at the science and technology. But then you look at a similar graph of the jobs available, and it's sort of the inverse. If you know about science and technology, you're much more likely to get a job than in a very much more competitive market with a degree in the humanities and social sciences. And that's just a fact. It's not, I don't think it's good or bad. It is the way the world is. And so I do think, even though they're at the moment, I have 6, 5, 4, and 3, so they're a little young, but I think that they do need to get excited by computers. And one of the reasons I wrote the book was my kids, who are their parents, the most boring subject they did at school at the age of 15 was a thing about information and communication technology. And that really, really is an indictment of our teaching system, that something as exciting as these transformations that are really changing the world, we made really, really boring. And the kids really didn't like it at all. So that's why I think you need to make it fun, you need to make it interesting, and you need to make it hands-on, that people can go do things. And I think there are things now. So I'm optimistic that we are engaging a much broader part of the population. But you know, popular science books, they're all over the place. But there aren't many popular computer science books, and that was one of the motivations. So I think I will stick with my getting to know if they can use computers and work with them and understand algorithms and things like that.
Okay, next question here is, since you are someone who has worked in academia and in the private sector and in the US and the UK, I'm interested in your thoughts about private companies cooperating with government intelligence agencies following 9/11 in this new age of computing. Yeah,
well, it's a complicated one, and at Microsoft, it caused us all sorts of complications because, you know, I do believe that the cloud is a way that many companies and organizations should go. Not least for security. I mean, if there's a break in the cloud, you can sue them. How many major US companies have had security breaches? A rather large number. But actually, if it's in the cloud, you know, somebody guarantees it, and you can sue them if it doesn't work. So, but on the other hand, you can understand European countries, China, and all these people not wanting to have their data held overseas, and then being obliged, the companies, to show that to the foreign government. So all sorts of complications, and I think these challenges are real, and I think we have to strike a balance between a reasonable amount of privacy, but also allowing our security services to be able to prevent disasters. And, you know, with the challenge of encrypted phones, encrypted signals, it's now getting very difficult because encryption technology is fairly standard, and, you know, the bad guys can encrypt their emails in a way that can't be read. And this is really deeply concerning, yeah. So I think we have to strike a balance, and that's, I think, what you see in the US with the big companies like Microsoft, of course, Google, and Facebook, you know, Apple taking a stand when they think there's been an unreasonable request. But I do think that we need to have cooperation and some clear guidance, and the same is true in the UK, because in the UK, the equivalent of the CIA, equivalent of NSA is GCHQ, and they've been collaborating for years. They started, you know, with Bletchley Park, with Alan Turing during the war, and they've kept doing it. Interesting, the Bletchley Park story is interesting. That was the first digital computer that was made with vacuum tubes, was actually the Colossus at Bletchley Park, and it was for decoding Hitler's own personal Lorentz system. It wasn't the one we all hear about, the Enigma. It was the Lorentz system, and it was more difficult. And these computers, they built 5 of them. And after the war, Churchill insisted that, and I think they built 10 of them, and 7 of them were destroyed, and 3 were moved to what became JCHQ. And why he did, and he insisted that Tommy Flowers, who built the machine, burned the plans, and so he went and burnt the plans because that's what Churchill told him. And the reason was that the US and the UK could then actually eavesdrop on people's communications, and nobody knew, because it was all sworn to secrecy, that the US and the UK could break their communications. And then, of course, instead of radio communications, it became messages on fibers and things, and that became unnecessary. But I think these issues are going to be with us for a long time, and privacy issues in general. There's an interesting novel about privacy called The Circle by Dave Eggers, and that's another scary novel which looks at the future of privacy. And there are other ones called Terms and Conditions, all of which I recommend you read.
Okay, we have a couple more questions. The next one is, if I am the business, as you said earlier, should I still be able to claim or own my personal data?
Oh yes, I think that certain personal data you should certainly claim and own and have private. And it could be health data, it could be all sorts of data, and you should have the right. And so while I was at Microsoft had the policy in the end of asking whether you wanted to opt in to have your data looked at, or rather than have to opt out. And the fact that you could opt in to let people look at your data, I think, is a much better way to go forward, and it gives you some confidence that you may be able to keep some things confidential. But it is a complicated world out there. But I do think, yes, you want to keep some data which is yours and private, and you can share it if you want to, but you're not automatically sharing it with the world. And we have to build systems that actually guarantee that, and that's again a real challenge. See, I find those challenges much more interesting than, you know, having all our brightest students figuring out how to make me click more on this advert or this link and that link. That's okay, and that's commercially useful, but I find that these other challenges are probably more interesting to me.
Okay, one more question here is computing and information are incredibly exciting, but how can we educate teachers who really understand and are passionate about computing? Right now, there are terribly few teachers who deeply understand computing.
No, you're absolutely right. That's a key thing. So one of the things I did at Microsoft was work in the UK. They have an initiative called Computing at Schools, and the government has understood the importance of this, and it has said that they will teach computing in the same computer science in the same way as we teach chemistry, physics, and biology from K through 12. And so you see there are now books. One of the things I sponsored was a book about early days computing, and there's now a project that Microsoft's also doing with the BBC, and it's a microbit thing, and it teaches kids how to compute. But you're right. The other thing that I worked with the UK Microsoft people was actually training teachers, because if you've got all schools having to teach computing, how do you do that? How do you train them? How do you actually get them to be confident in front of kids who may know more about computers in some cases than the teacher? So yes, so putting the effort into training teachers and having material that teachers can use and play with in private is absolutely vital. And in the UK, it's a much easier problem in the UK because it's more uniform. In the US, I've discovered education is a hot topic, and it's different in every state. And so therefore, it's difficult to get a one-size-fits-all. You couldn't do what you've just done in the UK, which is insist that schools teach computing from age 5 onwards in the same way as they teach the beginnings of physics and chemistry and biology. So educating the teachers is an important thing, and each year there's an annual conference called Computing at Schools. You could actually look it up on the web. You can see what they do, and they've now generated a huge amount of activity where they give courses and lectures and lots of material out there for teachers. But it's still a big ask because teachers are worried about the fact that they're older and they haven't been brought up with computers. So absolutely the right question, and I don't quite know what we do in the US, and it's more than just coding. So there's an coding initiative, which is a good thing, but actually you need to teach people that computing is more than just spreadsheets and word processors and coding. You have to have something smart like PageRank to code, and it's understanding that computer science is about how do you sort these 100 objects? What's the best way? How can you do it quickest? And so on. Those are the challenges of computer science, and we have to educate people to do all those things.
Okay, I think that about wraps it up here. Tony, thank you so much for this presentation, and I have a note here that I think comes from our director at RENCI, Stan Ahald, inviting you the next time you're in the U.S. or whenever you can to visit RENCI here in North Carolina and learn about what we're doing with software-defined networks, which I'm sure you'll find.
I mentioned, yes. I would like to find that, Stan, and that would be really great. Although North Carolina, I just learned from an environmental scientist friend of mine, has forbid any mention of sea level rise when you're doing real estate valuation near the coast in North Carolina.
Yeah, we won't get into that now, but...
No, I know. But that's something you might want to think about. Okay, I'd like to learn about networks, and it'd be great to come and see you. Yep, I look forward to that.
Yeah, and we appreciate your time. We appreciate the time of our attendees. This has been our first international webinar, and we're happy it went well. For those of you in the audience, a couple of announcements. Registration is still open for Data Matters, which is the week-long series of courses aimed at data professionals, sponsored by the NCDS, RENCI, and the Odom Institute. You can visit datamatters.org to look at courses and register. Also, remember, DataBytes is a monthly lunchtime if you're here on the East Coast of the U.S., lunchtime webinar series. We will be taking the month of July off because our webinar would fall right in the week of the 4th of July holiday, but we'll be back on Wednesday, August 3rd for a presentation on citizen science and data management issues, and we hope you'll be able to join us for that. So look for information coming shortly. Once again, thank you, Tony. Thanks, everyone, for attending, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, guys. Great pleasure.
Thank you.